South Africa is on the brink of collapse. Riots, triggered by the jailing of corrupt former president Jacob Zuma and the worsening COVID crisis, mask the deeper problems in South Africa. South Africa is a country facing deep structural economic, political, and racial problems that threaten to undo the progress made since the end of Apartheid. Corruption is rife, inequality is the highest in the world, unemployment is at 32%, and crime is through the roof. In this video, we'll discuss the root of South Africa's problems and what it needs to do to prevent a Zimbabwe-style collapse. Just before we start, don't forget to subscribe for more political analysis videos and hit that bell notification while you're at it. Zuma's revenge. The initial spark for rioting in South Africa lies in the trial of former President Jacob Zuma. Zuma served as president from 2009 to 2018. Under his tenure, corruption grew out of control and the economy ground to a halt. He was personally implicated in corruption scandals such as the Nkandla affair, where he used 246 million rand or $16 million of public funds to renovate his personal home in Nkandla, citing national security to justify the expense. He also made corrupt deals with the billionaire Gupta family from India and facilitated their capture of state institutions. Zuma's corruption and mismanagement began to take a toll on the popularity of the African National Congress, or ANC, which until that point had won every single national election since 1994 with over 60% of the vote. Zuma's approval ratings plummeted from a high of 67% to just 25%. Under increasing pressure from his own ANC party, he created the Zondo Commission in January 2018, led by Chief Justice Ray Zondo, to investigate corruption and state capture. But by February 2018, his own ANC forced him to step down in favor of Cyril Ramaphosa. Ramaphosa went on to win the 2019 elections with the lowest margin ever, 57%. Having been ousted from the presidency, Zuma now faced 16 counts of corruption, fraud, money laundering, and racketeering, and accusations of making 783 illegal payments. He was then asked to appear before the Zondo Commission that he created for 5 days in July 2019. As his defense, he claimed the existence of a vast foreign conspiracy against him and failed to show up on the fourth day of questioning. After 16 months of trying and failing to get him to show up in court, in December 2020, the Constitutional Court demanded that Zuma appear in court on February 4, 2021. He failed to appear, and so they issued a 15-month prison sentence for contempt of court. Having run out of options, on July 7, 2021, Zuma turned himself in to the police. His imprisonment sparked a wave of riots in his stronghold province of KwaZulu-Natal, which then spread to South Africa's economic heartland province of Gauteng. It appeared that the initial wave of riots was organized by Zuma supporters angry at his arrest, but was later taken over by opportunistic and desperate people looting shops and taking advantage of the chaos. After 6 days of looting, President Ramaphosa sent in 25,000 troops to restore order. But the damage had already been done. Over 200 people were killed, 800 stores were looted, $3.4 billion in property was destroyed, and the civil unrest will shrink the South African economy by 0.7%. Ramaphosa insisted that this was an attempted insurrection planned by Zuma's allies, and to some extent, he's right. Zuma's patronage network is finally being dismantled, and all his allies who benefited from corruption have a strong incentive to defend their wealth and stay out of jail, even if they have to destroy the country to do it. Indeed, the riots were concentrated in areas where Zuma still has strong support. But this analysis misses a critical point. This kind of social unrest was a long time coming due to both the short-term economic pains of the COVID crisis and the deeper structural problems in South Africa. South Africa is the worst affected country in Africa, with over 65,000 COVID deaths and the economy shrinking by 7% last year. In 2020, President Ramaphosa issued a COVID-19 stimulus grant of 350 rand, which is the equivalent of just $24 or 10% of the monthly minimum wage, far from enough. Many South Africans depend on the informal sector and so cannot survive lockdowns. But beyond the current crisis, the issue in South Africa is structural: systemic corruption and extreme inequality. State capture. Since the end of apartheid, South Africa has lost an estimated 1 trillion rand, or $68 billion, to corruption. That's 20% of South Africa's annual GDP. Now, it has to be said that South Africa sits at number 69 in the Corruption Perceptions Index, so it's far from the worst in the world, being about as corrupt as Hungary and Bulgaria. But corruption is destroying the country and has manifested itself in many ways. The most insidious forms are those of tenderpreneurs and state capture. Tenderpreneurs refer to government officials who use their political connections to distribute government tenders or contracts to their family and friends in exchange for massive kickbacks. Thus, they are entrepreneurs in the tendering process. Tenderpreneurs. This practice has undermined many of South Africa's state-owned companies, such as the National Electricity Producer, Eskom, the National Railway, Transnet, and the National Airline, SAA. These companies end up massively overpaying for contracts due to corrupt deals and are staffed by incompetent people due to nepotism. This has fueled poor service delivery, which in turn has fueled protests and political instability, undermining the economy. The rolling blackouts which have sporadically hit South Africa are just one symptom of the disease that is corruption. Worse still, private interests have captured state institutions. Under President Zuma's tenure, the Scorpions, an independent anti-corruption agency, was disbanded. This paved the way for the Gupta family to capture the state to benefit their business empire. They appointed Zuma's family members to high positions in their businesses and in exchange received government contracts and even told Zuma which ministers to name to his cabinet. When Zuma fired his finance minister at the request of the Guptas, the South African rand plummeted in value by 4% in one day. Wages stagnated, the national debt surged, and South Africa's currency tanked as investor confidence suffered. Thus, the corruption which peaked under Zuma's administration has led to a lost decade of economic growth in South Africa, providing the seeds for the current political instability. But the corruption in South Africa is not limited to Zuma or any particular individual. It's systemic, and much of this corruption is fueled by the nature of South Africa's political system. South Africa is still a democracy, with an independent judiciary, an independent media, and an independent electoral commission. But the election system is deeply uncompetitive. South Africa has been ruled by the African National Congress, the ANC, which is the party of Mandela, the party which ended apartheid, since 1994. Except in 2019, it has won every single national election since 1994 with over 60% of the vote. Now you might think, how is this possible? Especially since South Africa uses proportional representation, which usually creates many political parties and does not allow any single party to win a majority. A big part of this is because the ANC still enjoys widespread legitimacy for its role in dismantling apartheid and giving political power to the black majority. On top of that, the ANC itself is a broad coalition and encompasses a broad range of interests. In order to fight apartheid, the ANC established the Tripartite Alliance with COSATU, South Africa's largest trade union, and the South African Communist Party, an alliance which still stands to this day. So most of the country's trade unions are in bed with the ANC, as well as some far-left elements. The ANC itself also contains different factions. Essentially, it is a catch-all party with a broad appeal. But while the ANC presents itself as a center-left party, it has also embraced pro-business neoliberal interests, protecting the largely white or foreign-owned business elites. This happens because many members of the ANC have become co-opted into the business class themselves, forming a new black politically connected business elite, and so the ANC's policies reflect the same ideological catch-all nature. It combines welfarist policies like mass housing programs and welfare grants with neoliberal privatization and the embrace of foreign capital. The lack of viable alternatives also keeps the ANC in power. While South Africa has many opposition parties, there are only 2 or 3 relevant ones. The EFF, or Economic Freedom Fighters, with 11% of the vote, are a radical offshoot of the ANC, promising radical redistribution by expropriating all white-owned land without compensation. Essentially, they are a populist party that has weaponized racial resentment and racial inequality, but are too extreme for most South Africans. Then there's the DA, or Democratic Alliance, with 20% of the vote, which is a center-right pro-business outfit that likes to present itself as anti-corruption and as a party that can run things better than the ANC. It's also the party that most whites vote for, and so many black people perceive it as a white party. While half its members in parliament are white, about 2/3 of its electorate are non-white, mainly coloreds, Indians and middle-class blacks. Finally, the Inkatha Freedom Party, or IFP, with 2.4%, is a conservative Zulu traditionalist party that only gets votes in conservative Zulu-speaking rural areas. So that leaves the vast majority of voters who are working class or rural black South Africans with no alternative but the ANC or not voting at all. In addition to its catch-all nature, the legacy of fighting apartheid, and the lack of viable alternatives, the ANC is also able to use its incumbency to its own advantage. Because it is the governing party, it can use state resources and patronage to generate political support. A key example of this is extending patronage to the traditional chiefs. For those of you who don't know, in rural South Africa, traditional chiefs and kings still command great respect among the rural population and have some authority over customary law and traditional culture. By extending state resources to these chiefs, the ANC can gain support among rural constituents. An example of this is when Jacob Zuma passed laws expanding the powers of traditional chiefs and granting them a government salary. One study showed that support of traditional chiefs results in, on average, 6.5% more support for the ANC. The role of state media is also important. While private sector media is independent, the ANC has more influence over the public broadcaster, SABC. By placing ANC loyalists within the public broadcaster, it can influence political coverage. One study showed that in the 2016 local election campaign, the SABC gave 59% of its coverage to the ANC, while the DA and EFF were given 28% and 13% respectively. On top of that, while South Africa's proportional system prevents the use of corrupt tactics like gerrymandering, like in the United States, at the local level, the ruling party can redraw municipal boundaries to gain advantages in local elections. The sum total of all these factors means that while South Africa still has independent institutions, after all, even the president was not above the law, those institutions are being eroded by the uncompetitive nature of South African democracy. Because the ANC is guaranteed to win every election, they cannot be held electorally accountable and have no incentive to clamp down on corruption or improve the state of governance. The danger of this is not only that the country is becoming more corrupt and poorly governed, the danger is that the longer the ANC remains in power with large majorities, the more space they have to undermine state institutions to their own benefit and to ensure that they stay in power. Continued electoral dominance means that they could change the rules to their benefit and establish a government where the state and the party are the same thing. But it's not just South Africa's political problems that are undermining the country. Economic apartheid. The rule of the ANC ushered in the growth of a black middle class. But at the same time, inequality in South Africa is actually worse than during apartheid. The top 1% owns 42% of the country's wealth, and the top 10% owns 71% of the country's wealth, while the bottom 60% own just 7%. And the difference is visible from the sky. How is this possible? The ANC has failed to substantially reduce South Africa's inequality. South Africa is 80% black, 9% colored or mixed race, 8.5% white, and 2.5% Indian. Yet 68.5% of top management positions are occupied by whites, 73% of accountants are white, and 54% of engineers are white. Similarly, if we look at unemployment rates, 9% of whites are unemployed, 12% of Indians, 25% of coloreds, and almost 37% of blacks. In essence, even 27 years after the end of apartheid, the vast majority of the business elite and the professional upper middle class is white, and racial inequality remains baked into the system, and this is a direct legacy of apartheid. Now, such extreme racial inequality would lead to resentment and tensions in any country, but it's worse in South Africa because it's rooted in historical injustice, and that's where the issue of land and white farmers comes into play. In 1913, the Natives Land Act declared that black South Africans could only own land in 13% of the country, set aside as native reserves or Bantustans, despite blacks forming 70% of the population at the time. Meanwhile, in the 87% of the country where whites could own land, white farmers were stimulated with subsidies, loans, and equipment. This created a class of highly productive white farmers with a largely black workforce who owned most of the land. Now, the fact that this land was stolen meant that after 1994, the ANC promised to implement land redistribution. But this is a complicated issue. In most countries, the government addresses inequality by redistributing income through taxes. But to achieve land reform, you need to redistribute assets and businesses, not income. But the problem is that most of the people with the skills and capital to do commercial farming are white, while the black would-be recipients often don't have the skills or capital to run these farms at the same levels of productivity. So how do you achieve economic justice without undermining the economy? As a consequence, the ANC has failed to reach its target of redistributing 30% of the land within 25 years, redistributing only 10% of the land. This extreme racial inequality has led the land issue to become symbolic and politicized in South Africa. This manifested itself in the rise of the EFF led by Julius Malema. In essence, they promised to nationalize all industry and redistribute all the land by expropriating all white-owned land without compensation. Such a policy would be disastrous for two reasons. Firstly, such a chaotic undermining of property rights would cause foreign investment to flee the country, fearing that they too could have their property taken, causing economic collapse. Secondly, redistributing so much land without effectively training and financing the new black farmers would cause massive food shortages, undermining food security. Yet this message resonates among some people because it's an easy answer for people who haven't reaped the benefits of the end of apartheid for 27 years. For many South Africans, even though apartheid is over, they are still living under economic apartheid. Therefore, economic inequality is fueling racial resentment. This is something that the EFF has capitalized upon. Julius Malema has made countless incendiary remarks such as
shoot to kill them, kiss the poor, the farmer. We are not calling for the slaughtering of white people, at least for now.
Majority of Indians hate Africans. Majority of Indians are racist.
Essentially, South Africa has a dangerous cocktail. The white minority has most of the economic power, but the black majority has most of the political power. And if nothing is done about inequality, that political power will one day be used against the white minority. The hope and the danger. Rule by a single party is not sustainable. Monopolies, whether they're in economics or in politics, always lead to bad results. Without competition, the ANC has no incentive to improve, but there are signs of change. The ANC's vote share has been consistently declining every election since 2004, although voter turnout has also gone down. In the 2016 local government elections, the ANC's vote share slipped to 53%, almost losing its majority. They have also lost governance over major metropolitan areas such as Nelson Mandela Bay, Tshwane and Johannesburg, as well as the entire province of the Western Cape, which includes the city of Cape Town. This was a clear rejection of the corruption of Zuma and pressured the ANC into ousting Zuma in 2018, making way for Cyril Ramaphosa, who went on to win the 2019 elections with 57% of the vote, the ANC's worst national result ever. But political competition is not the only answer. In fact, in the short term, political competition could could cause the ANC to adopt reckless populist policies in pursuit of power. This is what happened in Zimbabwe. Just at the time that Zimbabwe was facing a pre-existing economic crisis and the British refused to finance comprehensive land redistribution, Mugabe faced both the rise of the opposition MDC and spontaneous land occupations by his own supporters. Partially as a ploy to win back his declining popularity, he allowed for the expropriation of white-owned land without compensation, which turned Zimbabwe's existing economic crisis into an economic catastrophe. The ANC could do the same. In fact, it almost did. Facing increasing pressure from the EFF, in 2018, Cyril Ramaphosa was pressured into creating a commission to look into amending Section 25 of the Constitution to allow for expropriation without compensation.
This conference, with overwhelming agreement, unanimous agreement, has resolved that the expropriation of land without compensation should be amongst the mechanisms available to government to give effect to land reform and redistribution. It has also been resolved that in implementing this decision, we must ensure that we do not undermine the economy, the agricultural production, and food security in our country. That is what is important.
Keep in mind, Ramaphosa is no radical. He is an arch-capitalist with major stakes in many South African companies. But he adopted this move in order to contain both the EFF as well as radical factions within his own party in the run-up to the 2019 election. Ramaphosa will not expropriate any land without compensation. In fact, merely the announcement that he was considering the possibility led the value of the rand to plunge against the dollar. But what happens if the ANC starts facing even greater electoral pressure from the EFF? What happens when spontaneous land occupations, which have already started in some parts of the country, become more widespread? If politicians feel the need to defend their ill-gotten wealth and remain in power through any means necessary, then they will do whatever it takes, including adopting irresponsible policies. As the economy worsens and the tax base shrinks, the party can no longer rely on distributing welfare benefits to guarantee the support of its working-class base. Instead, it could seize white-owned assets and distribute them to party loyalists in a bid to stay in power, as occurred in Zimbabwe, which would destroy the economy and democracy. Yet South Africa's institutions are much stronger than Zimbabwe's ever were. So this is a worst-case scenario. To avoid it, it is critical that the government do everything in its power to tackle corruption and extreme inequality and accelerate the pace of land reform without undermining agricultural production or the economy. Either all South Africans will share in the fruits of the nation, or none will. To learn more about how land reform went wrong in Zimbabwe, check out the second half of this video. Where do you see the future of South Africa? Leave a comment for the algorithm. Thank you to my Patreons, including Linda, Richard, Isenskild, and many more for making this video possible. Like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take